Okay. Hello. I think for my entry for demonstrating my philosophy and perspective towards teaching exceptional children, I was going to make a little video narrative where I just kind of talk about um, you know my ideas following the prompts that you've given us surrounding this semester. And I've just kind of written down a bunch of notes where I can just kind of go through. I went back through all the case studies and just wrote down the things that stood out to me the most and were the most meaningful and were things that I want to carry with me as I become a teacher in a classroom where I do have exceptional students that I need to tailor my teaching to. So, again, I'll be answering kind of each prompt as far as what exactly my philosophy is, how it connects to objectives for this class, how my approach and attitude has changed throughout this semester, and kind of intertwined in there. You should be able to see what I think is the most important aspect of teaching such students. So I guess I'll just start by going over some objectives. Like, I think the first objective from this class should be intertwined in everything that you take away from the readings and the case studies, just the way that the models and theories surrounding how to approach teaching such students. I think everything I'll talk about it is a theory, it is a model, it is a philosophy approaching such teaching. And then also, I guess I'll start by saying, trying to align my ideas with objective number two, which talks about legislation. And I think it's kind of hard to not talk about the IDEA Act and how that's influenced the way schools, districts, teachers, administrators, even the state approaches teaching such exceptional students. Because what stands out to me is the free access to public education, the FAPE, and then the LRE, the least restrictive environment. I think that FAPE in general, I don't know if that's how you say it, but that's how I was reading it throughout the year. The FAPE is so important that it just designates that it's the schools and the district's responsibility to provide the tools necessary for each student to have access to their LRE, or their least restrictive environment. Right? It's so important that our education students stay in the classroom as much as possible. And as a teacher, it is my responsibility to provide the tools necessary. And that kind of leads into a couple of my, big ideas for what I have to take with me as a teacher. And I think almost my whole philosophy is all about inclusivity, and how can I create a classroom environment where students with disabilities feel just as involved as any normal student, right? Because we've read so much about, in all these case studies, how isolated these students feel, how they feel as if they don't have any friends, they don't have people supporting them. In a lot of cases, they didn't have that support at home either. And it's my job as a teacher to design lessons and activities where they can feel involved. They can feel like part of the classroom just as much as any normal kid. I would say that's probably my biggest takeaway from this class, is, yeah, trying to build an inclusive classroom, and trying to figure out the tools and the supports that each student needs in order to succeed in their least restrictive environment, which should be in the general education classroom, not in like an intervention special education classroom, right? It's my job to help them succeed in my class. And I think a great way, just as I'm going through my notes here, a great way to do that is collaborating with specialists at your school. Just from experience, um, and this kind of connects with how my view has changed. Just from experience, I have found the special education teams at schools where I worked at super helpful when approaching such exceptional students, because sometimes as a teacher, just because there's so many different disabilities, I don't think I can be educated on like everything. Is like every disability, whether it's you know autism or a wheelchair or visual impairment. you know it is my responsibility to educate myself on such topics, but I will never be able to approach such students with the same amount of background knowledge as a specialist will. So I think it's super, super important to collaborate with specialist teams at your school to develop a plan, especially with the IEP, develop an IEP plan that is most suitable for such students. So I guess if I connect that to how my ideas have changed, last semester, because I'm a long-term substitute, I usually jump into classrooms when a teacher has a baby. And the fifth grade classroom I jumped into after last spring break, there was a really like a nonverbal student with autism, and he would kind of just sit in the back in color, and he had a brand new para who she was also super young and just kind of sat there. And as a teacher, I thought that it was just kind of her responsibility to get him through the day. But I mean, all he would do was sit there and color, which when I was reading one case study this semester about a student, oh, I forget what his name is, but he would just like nap in the back of the room and color, and then the parents came in and they were super upset that he wasn't involved in the class. That's honestly kind of how I was as a teacher. I just kind of let him sit back there. I was hesitant to interact with him just because I thought I wasn't approaching him like appropriately, just because I didn't have knowledge on much about autism and specifically about how how his autism affected him. So I just kind of let him sit back there and just let like the special ed team work with him. And this class has showed me that it definitely is my responsibility to work with the special ed team and come up with a plan that so he could have been more involved in the activities we were doing, right? I'm going back again to that inclusive factor, which is, the most important aspect, I think, of teaching such children. It's like, although they may be lacking, certain skills that they need for just general education, it's my responsibility to provide activities and lessons where I am allowing them to show their skills that they excel in. What are they good at? And how can I design a lesson where, they're just as involved as the rest of the students in the class? And that's kind of the way my feelings have changed, right? It's not just the special ed team's responsibility at the school. It's also mine. I have to work with them to develop a plan that works best to make sure each student is in their LRE, that least restrictive environment, where they are able to participate in with the rest of the students in the class. Yeah, and I guess what kind of connects to that too is going through a lot of the case studies. What stood out to me is that feeling of isolation, and a lot of these exceptional children have difficulty building relationships. And that's where including them as much as possible, I think just in classroom activities, will allow them to build relationships with their peers, right? If they're making friends, if they're having fun coming to school, it helps them succeed better, because we've just read so much about students who are disengaged and withdrawn from the classroom, and they're just sitting there by themselves, and they just feel left out, and they feel different. I mean, they're going to feel different. They're going to feel different their whole life, just because of their disability. And kids are mean, they're judgmental, there's always going to be bullies, but it's up to the teacher to create such a classroom environment where they are allowed to interact and make friends, and they're incentivized to interact and make friends, because it's so much more difficult going to school when you just feel isolated and you feel judged because you think that you're less than your peers based on your disability. And no one should feel that way. I mean, as a teacher and just as a person, right, I do not think anyone is less based on their disability, but it's easy for kids to judge others when someone with a disability can't do something and they can do it. And just building that classroom community of inclusiveness where disabled students do not feel left out, I think is very, very important. And that just takes extra work from a teacher. Kind of going on another, tangent here, it's like this kind of aligns with the objectives from the class 9 and 10, which talks about universal design for learning and just specific teaching strategies for each student. As a teacher, I know you're busy. It's hard already. You're dealing with 1,000 things. But I think it's very important to put in the extra effort working with the special ed team, working with the parents, or working with people at home that are taking care of these exceptional students. You need to work with them and put in the effort to develop the best plan possible. And, we've been reading all these case studies where it's like, oh, do you think so-and-so, such teacher, approached this situation best? Or like, do you think they could have done more? And I would think most students in this class would answer the same and saying, yes, I do think they could do more, right? They're just not putting in the extra time and effort to develop a plan that includes such exceptional students in their daily classroom activities. They're not putting in enough effort. And I think that's a big word there, effort. It definitely takes extra effort to teach such students, but I think as teachers, when we go into this profession, we are accepting that responsibility, right? Because we have to give every student their LRE. We've got to give them their least restrictive environment to learn the best they can, And as a teacher, I think it's important to understand when you are not able to do that on your own. Like maybe you need help from the SPED team, or maybe you need help from a specialist in order to give such students the education they need. And I just think it's important to understand when such students, like I was saying earlier, student just sitting in the back of the classroom just coloring, when that's happening, I need to be able to reach out maybe to administration or to some specialist as far as what can I do to make sure this student is getting the best education they possibly can. Let's see what else I highlighted that's important. Talks about bullying, right? Bullying will always be a thing, and I think that comes down to just fostering a classroom community that accepts everyone for their differences. Especially in Denver, I mean, it's very diverse just in general. I know we have lots of different cultures here. You need to create that community by acknowledging the difference between all of us. We're not all the same. Acknowledging them, learning about them. How is someone different who just came from Venezuela? Like, what is it like living there? Highlight the great things about your culture so everyone understands what is happening. We're learning about that, and just acknowledging, learning, then just accepting that everyone is different. Whether or not you're in a wheelchair or you have to sit close in the class because you can't see too well, or if you're deaf, or if you're a little behind in reading. It's the teacher's job to create that classroom community where students don't judge each other and like create like a hierarchy of, I feel like you're less than me because of this, and that will lead to bullying. And kind of talking about that was another thing that I wrote quite a bit and I highlighted is just the complexity between culturally diverse students, especially English language learners, and how that, and when just I don't know, I would say the trickiness when that gets intertwined with a disability, and when English language learners get identified as having a disability when in fact it's just that they're still learning the language. And as teachers, again, I cannot express enough how important it is to work with the specialists at your school, especially when evaluating an English language learner alongside with them maybe having a disability, and how important it is to try to evaluate a student like without grouping in the lack of their knowledge, right? Because it's hurtful for that student when they're pulled out of the class unnecessarily just because they are seen as being behind when they're really just still working on their English. And then they kind of, then it kind of becomes a pattern. Then they're behind each grade, then they're just throughout their entire, young education career, they're being pulled and pulled for having said disability when really they're still just trying to learn the language. And I just think that it's the responsibility of the school to properly evaluate such students, especially in Denver with so many Spanish speakers, just so we're not hurting them like by just not challenging them and putting them in these slower classes and kind of dumbing down the content just because we think they're slow when it comes to reading or something. But really it's the English that is tricky. Yeah, that's another thing I think is important, just because, yeah, like we've read about, those students are just overrepresented as having disabilities. I don't know if there's anything else I need to touch on. Let's see. I guess I could touch on another part of my philosophy is just clear communication with families and with the caretakers for such students, because we've read about how it is very difficult for families to take on the responsibility of raising such exceptional children. And, it takes extra money and effort and time to provide them with the supports that they need. And collaborating with them will help you as a teacher kind of understand maybe some more intricacies of what works, how can we get them engaged? What do they like to do? What are we doing at home? How can we do something similar at school and vice versa? Maybe, have some continuity there. Because a lot of the case studies we talked about, it's kind kind of hard to reach out to the families because in a lot of situations, these students have a very difficult time at home just because it is hard for such families to take care of them. And, it's like, do we need to do a home visit? Do we need to email more together? How can we use technology to reach out and really create the best plan we can for these exceptional students? And I think that is just about it. Yes.